The mud of the Keld Pass is the last thing I remember clearly. I had ridden ahead of my guard, one of many decisions I have since reconsidered, because the pass was supposed to be clear. It was not a border skirmish, 3 riders who had no business being on Sornmir's western road, and an arrow that found the gap between my riding coat and my saddle strap. I made it perhaps another half a mile before my horse slowed and my grip on the reins went soft. I remember the gray stone of a low holding wall, a yard with winter bare apple trees, a door that opened before I could knock. I do not remember going down. I was told later that I went down across the threshold like a felled tree. What I remember next is fire, not the roaring kind, the steady, unhurried kind that a person builds when they know what cold actually is. A stone hearth, a small room, the smell of pine resin and dried herbs, and a woman kneeling beside me in the firelight, pressing a cloth to my side with the calm of someone who had done this before and had no particular feelings about doing it again. She was not young in the way people mean when they call a woman young, and mean soft and uncertain. She was somewhere in that quiet middle of life where a person has stopped wasting time on things that don't matter. Dark hair pulled back, capable hands, eyes that assessed the wound first and me second, which was, I would come to understand, exactly the correct order. She did not ask my name. She did not ask where I'd come from, or who had put an arrow in me, or whether there were more of them coming. She said, "The arrow's out. Hold still," and that was the whole of our first conversation. I held still. I had not told her who I was. The riding coat I'd worn over the pass was plain. I had left my guard's colors and my own insignia with the column, traveling light as I sometimes do in the borderlands, where a king's crest draws more trouble than it deters. There was nothing on me to announce what I was. I was simply a large, wounded stranger in her doorway, and she took me in. That was the first thing I could not account for. I am not a man who fails to account for things. She gave me a blanket and a cup of broth, and went back to whatever she had been doing before I interrupted her evening. Through the open inner door, I could hear the sound of her moving through the house. Unhurried, efficient, the sound of someone who had learned to be their own company and found it sufficient. When she came back to check the wound, she brought a poultice that smelled of something astringent and green and worked better than anything the physicians in my hall have ever made. "You'll live," she said, resettling the cloth. "The cold will have slowed the bleeding. Sleep." I slept. It was 2 more days before I could sit upright without the room tilting, and those 2 days gave me a great deal of time to observe the holding from where I lay. It was small, 2 rooms, a good stone barn I could see through the window, fence lines that ran out to the tree edge where the Veldrath land went gray and scrub still in the early frost. She worked it alone. I watched her cross the yard in the pewter morning light, carrying feed for the horses, speaking to them in a low voice I couldn't hear through the glass. There were wolves at the far fence line, 3 of them, settled in the grass with the ease of long familiarity, watching her as she moved. She passed within arm's reach of the largest without pausing. It lifted its head, and she reached down and put one hand between its ears and kept walking. I had been around wolves my entire life. They do not do that with strangers. They do not do that with most people who are not strangers. On the 3rd day, I was well enough to eat at the table, and she sat across from me with her own supper and did not make any ceremony of it. The fire was at her back. The mark on my left wrist had been bothering me since the first night, a low, steady warmth, barely there, easy enough to dismiss as proximity to the hearth. I dismissed it. "The riders who put that arrow in you," she said, cutting bread. "Were they herons?" I looked at her. She was looking at the bread. "I don't know whose men they were," I said, which was true enough. "Who is Heron?" She set down the knife. "The man who holds the Eastern Valley and would like to hold this land too." She said it without heat, the way you name weather. "He has made offers. I have declined them. In the last season, he has taken to sending his riders through the outer fields to make the point another way." She said nothing more about it. I waited for anger, for fear, for the calculation of someone weighing their options aloud. None of it came. She picked up her bread, and the conversation moved to other things. The state of the pass road, whether the frost would come early, and she did not return to Heron. I thought about that for a long time that night, lying in the fire's glow with the warmth on my wrist, pulsing steadily, and the wolves quiet at the fence. There is a kind of courage that announces itself constantly that needs to be seen to feel real. I know that kind well. I have seen it at every table in every great hall I have ever presided over. Then there is the other kind, the kind that simply gets on with things, that holds the line without making a speech about holding it. I had not seen that kind often enough to recognize it immediately. It took me a few days. By the 6th night, I was on my feet, still slow, still careful about the left side, but upright. She let me help with the evening feed without comment, which I appreciated more than I had expected. We worked in the barn in a companionable silence that required nothing from either of us, and when we came back inside, she made tea. I sat by the fire and I watched her unpin her hair and comb it out by the light, and the warmth on my wrist became something I could no longer pretend was the hearth. I had heard the bond described many ways. My mother's physician had called it a recognition, the deep part of you seeing what the eyes take longer to understand. My old captain had called it a weight that lifts, as if something you'd been carrying without knowing it was finally set down. Neither description had meant much to me, sitting in a hall, listening. Both of them were exact. Sitting beside this woman in a firelit room on the Veldrath frontier. She did not know it. She was simply combing her hair. She was not trying to be anything in particular. That was precisely the point. I left before she woke the next morning. I am not proud of it. The wound was well enough. My horse rested, and I had already stayed longer than sense allowed. My guard would be circling back through the pass, looking for me, and a king who disappears for 7 days generates a particular kind of alarm that is difficult to contain once it spreads. I left coin on the table, enough to be useful, not so much as to be an insult, and I rode. I told myself I would find a way back. I told myself I would learn her name properly, announce mine, begin at the beginning the way a man should. The bond on my wrist was a low gold heat all the way through the pass, and then all the way down the long road to Sornmir's eastern gate, and it did not cool when I reached home. It simply settled in, steady as banked coals, waiting. I was 3 days back in the hall before I found out. My steward brings me the frontier dispatches every week. Reports from the border land keepers, disputes over grazing rights, the usual friction of a kingdom's edges. I was reading through them without great attention when a name stopped me. Veldrath Holding. A woman named Fen, daughter of the late keeper Aldrich, holding the northwest parcel alone since her father's death 2 winters past. Complaints filed against a man named Harren, who had claimed right to the outer fields by some manipulation of the border lease records, and whose riders had been making the point with more than paperwork. 3 complaints, each one measured, specific, and completely ignored by the Eastern Circuits Administration, which Harren had been buying quietly for some time. The warmth on my wrist flared once, sharp like a struck flint. I looked up at my steward. How long has this been in the file? He had the good sense to look uncomfortable. The first complaint is 6 months old, my lord. I was in the saddle within the hour. I rode with 12 of my guard this time. No disguise, no plain coat, the crest of Sornmir at the column's head. We made the Veldrath frontier in a day and a half, pushing hard, and we came down the gray rock road toward her, holding, in the early light of the second morning she was in the yard. Harren's riders were at the gate, 6 of them, mounted, with Harren himself at their center on a heavy gray horse. He was a broad man going to fat, with the particular confidence of someone who had never been told no by anyone capable of making it stick. He was speaking to her in the tone of a man explaining something obvious to someone slow. She was not slow. She was standing in the middle of her yard with her arms at her sides and her chin level, and she was not moving, and Harren's 6 riders and his 2 decades of unchallenged dominion over the Eastern Valley had not budged her 1 inch. I had not announced myself. The column had come down the road behind me while they were occupied with her, and when Harren's nearest rider finally turned and saw the crest of Sornmir, the color went out of his face in a way that would have been almost amusing in other circumstances. Harren turned. His confidence lasted about 3 seconds. My lord, he started. I rode past him. I rode through the open gate of the holding and across the yard, and I stopped my horse 6 feet from where she was standing. And I looked down at her, and she looked up at me, and for a moment neither of us said anything. She saw who I was. I watched her understand it, not in a flash of shock, but in the slow, settled way she did everything, the way she'd assessed the wound before she assessed me. Her expression moved through something careful and quiet, and arrived at something I couldn't quite read. Then she said, evenly, "You left money on the table." "I know," I said. "I owe you more than that." The mark on my wrist had gone from warmth to light, a visible thing, gold threading through the skin, bright enough to be plain even in the gray morning. She saw it. She looked down at her own left wrist, and was still for a moment, and then she looked back up at me. Behind me, I could hear the shift of Harren's horse, the creak of a saddle, the sound of a man calculating whether the king of Sornmir was truly here on a frontier road at dawn, and deciding that he was. "Harren," I said, without turning. "This holding is under the personal protection of Sornmir's crown from this morning. The outer field is claimed will be returned within the fortnight, under seal. His riders will leave this road today." A silence. Then the sound of horses moving back and away. I got down from my horse. It is not a graceful thing. getting off a horse when you have 7 days on a wound in your left side. I managed it without disgracing myself entirely. I walked to where she was standing, and I held out my left hand, and the mark on my wrist was burning clean gold in the cold light. She looked at it for a long moment, then she looked at my face. You were a great deal of trouble as a stranger, she said. I can only imagine what you're like as a king. Considerably more, I said. I won't pretend otherwise. A pause. The wolves at the fence had all turned toward us. One of my guard coughed softly and was silenced by the man beside him. All right, she said, and she put her hand in mine. The bond sealed on the instant, a warmth that went from wrist to chest to somewhere deeper than either, the kind of warmth that does not cool, that has no intention of cooling. I stood in the yard of the most unremarkable holding on Sornmir's frontier with a woman who had taken me in without ceremony, nursed me without pity, fed me without debt, and held her land against a warlord without making a speech about it, and I understood something I had failed to understand in 30 years of sitting on a throne. The crown announces you. The mark knows you. They are not always looking at the same person, and on the road through Keld Pass, stripped of the first, I had met the second. She is Luna of Sornmir now. The title is recent, the rest of it is not. The rest of it began in the mud of the Keld Pass, and a doorway that opened before I could knock, and it has not stopped since, and I have stopped wanting it to.